So very, very good performance in terms of sharpness from this lens. Top marks, Yongnuo. Well done for sharpness. Well, hey everybody, thank you for checking in once again and welcome to another episode. Well, today we're going to have a look at a real beaut of a lens. It's this one. It's a modern lens, autofocus. It's the 85mm f1.8 from Yongnuo, and this is a really nice lens. It's the second version of this lens. There was an earlier version with a plastic body, but this one has an all metal body, so more quality. I believe it's made from aircraft metal, which is an aluminium magnesium alloy, if I'm not mistaken. This is the perfect focal length for my photography. I do like a little reach in a lens, but this lens isn't too long. It's not as though it's a 135 that gives you quite a lot of reach, but can sometimes be a little too much. But it's quite a bit more than a 50, which I find is sometimes a little too short for my photography. I've been out and about shooting this lens over the past few days. I've been doing general photography with it. I've done a couple of portraits with it. I've just shot the flipping heck out of it. But before we talk about how it performs and its optical qualities, let's have a look at the lens a little more closely. So there is our lens, and it's sitting on the Sony A7 at the moment here. There is the lovely big front element, and you can see the coatings that are applied there. It seems to have traces of purple, traces of bluey green sort of colour. That is a lovely big front element. The lens has a lovely focusing ring here, and it turns very, very smoothly and cleanly. And there is a customizable button on this lens. If we look around the other side, we've got this little customizable button here that can be used to assign functions, and we've also got an AF/MF switch here. The minimum focus distance for this lens is 0.8 millimeters, so just short of 3 feet. It has 9 optical elements, and they're arranged in 8 groups, so 1 pair. And the aperture settings run from f1.8 down to f16. We'll just have a look at the rear of the lens there. There's the rear element and the gold-plated contacts for communication with the camera body. We've got more coating on there. The markings on this lens are engraved, so that's nice to see. The general feeling of quality is very high on this lens. There is a rubber gasket on the back here. I don't know if you can see that rubber gasket that goes all the way around there, and that is part of the dust and weather sealing that this lens has. So this really is a quality object and a very, very nicely made lens. The general feeling of quality is very high, and it does feel like a premium product. So a very nice lens, certainly in terms of manufacture. You can see that it's not too long a lens. It's not too much longer than a 50mm, which might come to about there. So it's, you know, just a little, maybe an inch longer than your average 50mm lens. So it's really not too big, and it's not particularly heavy either. It does have a little bit of heft to it, but that's not a bad thing. It doesn't want to be, shouldn't be too light. So it does have a little bit of weight and a little bit of heft to give it some substance. So let's now have a look at how this lens shoots, and we'll consider colour performance first. Well, now the colours of this lens are quite something to behold. They really are very vivid, very dynamic. They've got lots of strength, they've got lots of body and lots of depth. They really are fantastic colours. They're saturated, which is just how I like colours. I like plenty of pop in an image. and this lens will deliver that feel. It really is a lovely lens for colour performance. I wouldn't call it a warm lens. I really don't think it's warm. I think it's on the cool side of things. I actually rather prefer lenses that are just slightly on the cool side rather than going into the warm side. That's just a personal preference, but for me it shoots really nicely. Very vivid, very powerful colours with loads of strength, loads of kick. There really is quite a riot of colour going on here, and yet it's never too saturated, it's never too pumped up or in your face, and it can give some very nice, very delicate sort of colours in the right conditions. And it's in those conditions that you notice that this lens is actually on the cool side, and it's giving colours shifted slightly over towards the blue end of things rather than towards the red. Contrast from this lens is very strong indeed, and that strong contrast really supports the colour performance. The contrast doesn't really ever drop. In fact, even if you shoot directly into the sun, this lens, the coatings are that good that contrast obviously will drop a little, but it really doesn't drop by much. It only drops by a very small amount, even shooting directly into sunlight. So very, very good, very effective coatings on this lens, and a very strong performance in terms of contrast. It doesn't actually flare very much either, and in fact I couldn't really get any flares out of it at all, so it's very, very resistant to flaring, unlike some of the vintage lenses that we've often looked at on here. I do actually like a little bit of flaring now and again. I think it can make a really interesting streak through an image, but if you're the kind of photographer that doesn't like that effect, then this lens is perfect, because it just doesn't do it. It's very, very well protected against any sort of incursion from stray light into the lens, and it does come as extra added protection, as if its performance weren't already enough. It does come with this clip-on hood here. This actually is not metal, this is some sort of plastic, maybe it's carbon fibre, but it's lined inside nicely with some sort of matte finish, rubber finish, to damp the reflections down. So that is probably a useful addition. Right, what else have we got? Very good for colour and contrast. Sharpness, well, gosh, modern lenses by and large are very, very sharp, but this one really, I think this is possibly, I don't like making big claims of this kind, but it's possibly the sharpest modern lens I've shot. It's very, very sharp indeed. It's incisively sharp. It's bitingly sharp. Wide open in the centre at any rate. It's very, very sharp indeed. And I couldn't see any difference stopping the lens down for centre sharpness. It really doesn't change by much. It must get a little bit sharper, but I couldn't actually see it. Zooming into the images, I couldn't see any difference from f1.8 right up to f8, which is actually the sweet spot for this lens. But what does happen is the sharpness, as you stop down, it spreads across the frame. So wide open, the sharpness is in the centre. The edges can be just slightly soft, not soft in vintage lens terms, of course, because those are really soft at the edges sometimes, but slightly soft, wide open at the edges in modern lens terms. But that softness disappears as soon as you begin to stop down. Those edges tighten up and sharpen up. But certainly shooting wide open in the centre, I couldn't actually see much difference in sharpness between wide open aperture setting at f1.8 and, you know, any further setting that it might be stopped down to, f2.8, f5.6, even f8. I couldn't see much difference, if any. So a very, very strong performance for sharpness. And what that means is that you can leave your lens fully open if you want to do a portrait, because this is a lovely portrait lens. If you want to do a portrait, you can leave your lens fully open, and you know that if your subject is more or less in the center of your frame, you know that's going to be a very sharp image. So no worries as far as that goes. And keeping it wide open, of course, for a portrait means you get maximum background blur. So very, very good performance in terms of sharpness from this lens. Top marks, Yongnuo. Well done for sharpness. All right, let's have a look at the background blur that this lens puts out. And it's a fairly long lens, and it's got a fairly fast aperture of f1.8, so it can make a lot of blur. This is a blur monster, this lens. There's no doubt about it. There's plenty of blur on offer here. But what's the quality of the blur like? Well, modern lenses do tend to make very nice, very pleasing, very soft, very uniform background blur. And this one obeys that rule. The blur coming from this lens is absolutely beautiful. It's very, very soft. It's very, very lovely. It's very, very smooth. And unlike a vintage lens, which very often has harsh points that occur in the blur where it turns a bit rough with changing distances between camera, subject and background, this one, again, like a lot of modern lenses, stays uniformly smooth. There's no point where it turns rough. There's no point where it turns harsh. It's just lovely. Now, that's great for portraits. Portraits need, traditionally anyway, some lovely soft blur in the background. This one will give you bucketfuls or buckets full of blur. It's got plenty to offer in that department. Specular highlights, that is point light sources in the background, are almost all circular. Right at the very edge of the frame you can see them begin to squash slightly into sort of elliptical cat's eye shapes, but that doesn't happen too much. So generally uniform specular highlights from this lens. So very, very nice blur performance, and you can be sure that that blur is going to stay nice and smooth as those distances change. So very, very nice blur that this lens puts out. Chromatic aberration, well, there is a tiny little bit, but it is only a tiny, tiny little bit when you're fully open, when you're shooting at f1.8. It's nothing like you get from a vintage lens. It's very, very hardly noticeable, and I did have to zoom in really quite a lot to see any trace of it, and I just wouldn't have seen it if I hadn't zoomed in and pixel peeped a little bit. So you're only really going to see any hint of chromatic aberration if you're fully open and you really zoom in on those details. So a very good performance, not absolutely perfect, but very, very good performance for chromatic aberration. Vignetting, well, it does show a little bit of vignetting actually when you're shooting fully open, and if you've got a light background, a sort of a light uniform background, you will notice it. Corners are a little dark at f1.8. As you stop down, that disappears and it's gone by round about f4, certainly completely disappeared by f5.6. I don't mind it actually, and it is significantly reduced at f2.8. I actually rather like it, and I think it can be quite a nice effect for framing a subject. But yeah, there is a little bit of vignetting from this lens. It's a long, fast lens, so it's not entirely surprising that there is going to be a little bit creeping in there. But it's substantially gone by f2.8, and it's completely gone by f4, f5.6 or thereabouts. This is an autofocus lens, so let's just check out the speed at which it focuses. I have been using it on my Sony a7 Mark I, which was never famous for the speed of its focusing. It always was slightly slow at focusing, certainly with the older lenses that it came with on release, lens I should say. But let's just see how quickly it focuses. I found it focuses very quickly, but let's just do a quick test. I'll shoot the camera that's shooting us. That was pretty quick. We'll change the distance. Pretty quick. Back to the camera that we're shooting with. And that's very fast indeed. That's no slouch at all. And especially when you consider that we're shooting on the A7 Mark I, which does have slow autofocus. They got much quicker in subsequent models. So I'm entirely happy with that autofocus performance. I can't see any problems with that at all. And in use, I never thought to myself, gosh, that's a bit slow, isn't it? Because it isn't. It's actually really fast. So just lovely, just a lovely lens. It's got everything you could want in a longer lens of this kind. It's made very nicely of metal, of aircraft metal. It's got a lovely premium feel. It's got a customizable button on the side, plus an autofocus manual focus switch there. And perhaps most importantly of all, it shoots really, really nicely, and it does make exquisite images. The images that come out of this lens are absolutely beautiful. So a really nice portrait lens, a really nice general photography walk around lens. It's not too heavy, it's not too big, it's not much bigger than your average 50mm. It goes straight onto the camera, of course. No need for an adapter with this one, so that keeps the rig relatively small. So a very nice lens indeed. A lovely piece of modern glass that I very much enjoyed using. So there we are. That's the Yongnuo 85mm f1.8. So I guess that is about it from me for this time. Thank you to everybody who's watched. Thank you to everybody who tunes in and comes back to this channel and watches these episodes. I do appreciate that. If you've enjoyed this episode, why not chuck us a sub? That would be very much appreciated too. Many, many thanks go to subscribers for your support. That is heartfelt, genuine thanks. Thank you for that. And also many, many thanks to patrons for your support. That is a genuine, heartfelt thank you for that support. And if you like the videos on this channel, you might consider becoming a patron yourself. You can do that over at www.patreon.com/Zenography, and you can do that for as little as $1 per month. So as for me, that is it for now. So if you're not doing anything too troublesome, annoying, or anxiety-inducing next week, why not tune in and join me for another episode of Zenography. Thanks everyone. Cheerio.